Well, there is little doubt that the U.S. is undergoing profound changes under a second Trump administration and one that's challenging the global order. Well, a new report that's about to be published by the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney will be unpacking Trump 2.0, from the tariff shocks to critical minerals and America's relations with its traditional and non-traditional allies. Jared Mondschein is one of the contributors to the report, and he joins me now. Jared, good to have you with us. Now, there is an incredible amount to unpack when it comes to Trump 2.0. So many audacious moves, and it's barely been about 6 months. But what might be the number one policy priority, Jared, that he really wants to nail down that might sort of focus our discussion here?
I think from his perspective, the number one thing he cares about most is tariffs. And that's his own policy priority. He has not been consistent in a lot of areas of his life. He hasn't been consistent in his politics. He used to be a Democrat, now he's a Republican. He's not consistent in his policies. You only have to look at what he said during the campaign about immigration and how in many ways he had a more lax approach to immigration at certain times in his 2024 campaign than he did elsewhere. But you also should look at his consistency on tariffs. And he will consistently want to use tariffs, but he will also consistently be constrained by both public opinion and the markets, especially the bond market. But beyond that, I think what we want to do with this report more than anything else was focus on what is actually staying the same and what is actually unique to Trump, because there's actually a lot more continuity than either President Trump or Kamala Harris would have wanted to admit.
Yes, and on his tariffs policy, what has he been trying to do? Is it a genuine attempt to change the global trade order, or is it for him to basically have and control the bargaining chips that he thinks he might have?
I mean, why not both, right? I think in many ways, trying to figure out what he wants on tariffs is really challenging. And that's why you haven't actually seen many agreements been released or been announced instead of just the beginnings of discussions of agreements, because no one's really sure what would satiate the president and this administration. But I think what's important to note here, though, is again, what is unique to him and what is something that was happening long before and will likely happen after him? And something like the World Trade Organization. Many people highlight the fact that Donald Trump is not a big fan of it, but let's not forget which president actually stopped approving judges going on the appellate body of the World Trade Organization, the dispute mechanism, the sort of the most important part of the World Trade Organization in many ways. And that was the Obama administration. And then the Trump administration continued halting appointments, and then the Biden administration did as well. I think we should look at sort of the structural dynamics that are actually still going on regardless of who the president is.
Yes, and do you think that's the same in one of the domestic policies? He's making that promise throughout the campaign and now to make America a manufacturing superpower and bring jobs back to the U.S. Is he experiencing any success here? Because we have seen some car makers like Hyundai, for instance, investing billions there when Trump came to power.
Yeah, it's not unique to any U.S. president to want to expand U.S. manufacturing and to increase it. Again, that's something that every president in modern history has called for. But in terms of the type of manufacturing, that's still a debate. Right now, there's a debate about this big, beautiful bill that is now with the Senate after passing the House. And on that, you can see that the Senate Republicans and the Trump administration were against the manufacturing incentives that the Biden administration supported in the Inflation Reduction Act. And those manufacturing incentives, they're against them because they were for clean energy projects. Now, will that actually continue in the Senate bill? That's still to be determined, because a lot of those clean energy projects were actually about 77% of them were actually in Republican districts. So as a result, there's still a lot of debate to be had about whether they are going to get rid of that manufacturing incentive.
Let's look at foreign policy now, Jared, and let's bring it back to Australia first. Where do you see relations heading with Australia? Because I think he's got off, I think Anthony Albanese has got off on the right foot after he won the recent elections. And where do you see the AUKUS agreement heading towards in that context?
Yeah, a few countries weathered the first Trump administration better than Australia, and I think there's lots of reasons for Australia to continue to fare well in the second Trump administration, because ultimately all the things that Donald Trump is sensitive to play to Australia's favor. Australia has a trade deficit with the United States. Australia is increasing its military spending. Australia is moving closer to the United States with its AUKUS program, and Australia is actually paying the United States for nuclear-powered submarines. It is a good deal what Australia has with those nuclear-powered submarines. And in many ways, I have to wonder whether the model that Australia has basically created with the United States, in which it is paying to expand U.S. industrial capacity to build more submarines, is something that the Trump administration will want to replicate with other allies, especially in Europe, because there's a land war in Europe right now, and a number of European countries, as well as Canada, are still paying less than 2%. That's not Australia. Australia is paying more, and it's being asked to pay even more than that. But Australia is also willing to engage the U.S. in a way that a lot of European countries are simply not.
Yes, and do you think Trump 2.0, one of its characteristics was for Trump to get what he wanted in terms of forcing the agenda in Europe? You mentioned Europe, of particularly NATO nations, member nations of NATO, to markedly increase their defense spending. And we saw that with the UK, and we've seen others who've gone up to 5-6% of their GDP spend on defense.
Right. Yeah, I think only a couple have gone above 3%. I think that the Eastern Europeans are perhaps the models there, because they feel that that threat from Russia more acutely. But again, this is another thing where I think there's a lot more commonality between prior U.S. administrations and Democratic administrations than people may realize. As much as Donald Trump is more explicit in his criticism of NATO, we shouldn't forget what the Obama administration Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said to NATO members. He basically said, a future president may not like this deal because you are simply not doing enough. Donald Trump was essentially more explicit and more aggressive in his criticism of NATO, but by no means was he the first U.S. president to criticize NATO. The criticism of NATO goes back decades. It's been in existence for a very long time, and I think Donald Trump has just been the most aggressive about it in modern history.
And going to events in Europe and specifically the war in Ukraine, President Trump has tried to hasten an end to the war. But what does his lack of success on that front tell us about U.S., about the reliability of America on global security?
Yeah, I think there's no denying that the Oval Office blow-up between Zelensky, J.D. Vance, and Donald Trump was not something that U.S. allies looked on feeling positive about. But at the same time, if you look at on the ground what's actually changed and what stayed the same is that U.S. support for Ukraine has at times been halted during the initial stages of negotiations, but actually is continuing now. Weapons transfers continue now. If anything, Ukraine actually has more ability to strike deeper into Russia with different types of weapons than they did previously. And so on the ground, the situation for Ukraine is obviously not great, but it is not markedly worse than it was just a few months ago.
And finally, Jared, in more recent days and weeks, Pete Hegseth, he's been beating, America's drums in the Indo-Pacific region during his visit there. Do you see any changes on that front as China, continues to become more assertive in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, everyone is focusing on that 3.5% that Secretary Hegseth said, but I think focusing on the number misses the point of the criticism. And I think there's a lot of concern, including in Australia, that it's not a matter of a percent or a specific number, but of capability. Does Australia have the capability to have the surveillance to know whether ships are circumnavigating it aggressively? Does Australia have the capability to have a extended strike capability in the case of a contingency in the region? Does Australia have these basic military capabilities beyond AUKUS? There's a lot of certainty about AUKUS, and I think Americans and the Brits are positive in the way that Australia is pursuing AUKUS, but there still is a lot more to do because ultimately AUKUS is a long-term investment with long-term returns. In the immediate term, there's a lot more militarily that Australia can do. And that's the view of many in Australia, many in the US, and elsewhere.
Okay, Jared Mondschein, there can be never enough time to completely unpack even 6 months of a Trump administration, and that is the job of the report that you're working on. But thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.